Hello and welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives. I'm Ciaran Bradley. Today we have something a little bit different for you. Mick and Paul will be discussing their experiences of being crime journalists in Ireland. They'll be telling us more about how they got into the industry, the joys and the occasional perils of reporting on crime, as well as the future of crime journalism and print media generally. The hope is that you find it interesting and informative, and hopefully instructive on how stories come to print. With any luck, it'll shine some light and be helpful as well to any budding journalists out there. Oh, and I should mention there's a little bit of feedback on my line for the first few minutes, but it clears itself up. In our haste to get this to you, I couldn't find my earphones, and there's nothing quite like a producer who doesn't follow his own rules. So, without further ado, here are the lads. We're doing something slightly different today. We want to give you guys a little bit of an insight into journalism, into crime journalism, and also into the media landscape more widely, because it's obviously become quite an issue over the last few years in a number of ways. We have two people here who have made their particular hills of beans through journalism and crime journalism in particular. So I'm really looking forward to the chat, lads. I might just start by spooling back to the beginning, as we want to do. Why did you guys become journalists? I might start with Paul first.
That's a good question. I think I kind of just always wanted to be a journalist. I had that in me from an early age. I can recall going to a guidance counsellor in secondary school, a mandated thing where you're getting career advice, and I think I kind of wish it was. I just said, I remember thinking on the spot, I want to be a journalist. I just had that kind of in me at age whatever it was, 13, 14, I want to be a journalist. And I can recall that guidance counsellor actually telling me, no, don't do that. And basically told me to go and do an arts degree, because if you go and do an arts degree, well, at least you'll have other options, because people who go to journalism college, they get turned off journalism, and they then, that's the only option they have. That was her advice. So I actually ended up going and doing an arts degree. That stuck with me, and I did English and history in UCD, and I floated through it. And I didn't really know. I mean, I even in college, I was thinking about what other options could I be a teacher, but I kept coming back to journalism. And ultimately, I applied for the infamous JobBridge scheme, which many people lambasted, but it was good for me in the sense that I got my foot in the door in the Tallaght Echo, the local newspaper in Tallaght, and covered Ballyfermot and Palmerstown and Clondalkin as well. And I was there for 9 months. I actually ended up being there for a year. Under the JobBridge scheme. It was 9 months originally, and then was there for the year, and that's where I got my experience. And then I got into the Indo, and eventually into the Star. But yeah, I just kind of always wanted to be a journalist. I just had it in me instinctively. I didn't know I wanted to be a crime journalist, but I knew I wanted to work in newspapers. I knew I wanted to get involved in the industry.
Well, we'll certainly revisit what brought you into crime, or at least reporting on it, in a little while. But it's interesting that you say that, because I remember getting similar advice from someone in my family who was a journalist to go and do an arts degree and then come back to it. But Mick, I'm very interested into your background. Obviously, you're from Belfast. You know, what was your particular route?
Well, one of the things I like about this pod is that I feel very close and connected to the listeners. And I'm sure Paul does as well. But that means we'll have to be honest. So I'm going to be honest about something that happened to me. Looking back, it had a massive effect in my life when I was 12. Okay. And I'm going to talk about, I've never really spoken about this before. My family know about it, but I'm going to talk about it. So obviously I grew up in North Belfast. And when I was 12, one day, my father and I were sitting with my my eldest brother, his best mate, and his father were in the house. And I just remember my daddy sitting there, and he suddenly, you know the way you put your finger and thumb up to make the shape of a gun? Because I wasn't listening. 12-year-old kids. Now, this was in the 80s, so there were no mobile phones, or I was probably reading a comic or something. And he held up a gun, and all I heard him saying is, yeah, and he tried to shoot me. Right? So what the hell was this all about? So essentially, when I was 12, I heard my father telling my big brother's best mate's dad about an attempt on his life by loyalists in 1972. So I was 18 months old. And I have to say, I've been asked an awful lot, because I wrote a book, and it was a lot of interviews I did about why I became a journalist. And I always talk about seeing the film All the President's Men when I was around the same age. And that was a massive factor. But seeing, if I'm being totally honest, me hearing about an attempt on my father's life at that age totally changed my life. And I think it actually put me, I've no doubt, it put me on the road for being a journalist, because suddenly I went from a 12-year-old child to someone who became aware that there was badness in the world. He survived the murder, but it was essentially a loyalist gunman knocked on the door. We were living in a loyalist area, 1972. We were living in a loyalist area, 2:00, banging the door. My daddy's half asleep, walking down the stairs. They answered him, hold on, what's going on? He slowly went back upstairs, looked outside the window, and there was a man standing at the foot of the path, about 10 feet from the house, pointing a Luger pistol at the door, waiting for my daddy to answer it. So that was a real sliding doors moment for me. I often think about this. We are a very, very working class family. There were 7 kids. And we're the youngest. I have a twin brother, so we're the youngest. So we're the babbies. You know, I'm far from a babby now. But I often wonder how our lives would have turned out if my daddy had opened that door. So something exploded in me that day, and I became aware, and I started reading the news, listening, watching TV, reading the news, reading newspapers, watching the news. I think it was that incident that made me aware, made me awake, and is why I'm a crime reporter today.
I might just dig into that a touch more, just for a number of reasons. My father's from Derry, my family are all from Derry, and I did my dissertation at university about journalistic independence in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, so I found that always really interesting. So I was always circling the drain of journalism myself in a little way. But I do, one thing that always strikes me with the North is, in situations like that, which are frankly traumatic, they are traumatic to a young mind in one way or another. My old man went through Bloody Sunday in Derry in 72 and was there for that period, and he saw people in his class hive off, join the IRA, and or in later in the Troubles, albeit a less beaten path was for some nationalists to join the police, although that obviously that was a lot more fraught. What drew you then to journalism rather than, I guess, any number of other paths? Because you've always seemingly had a very strong interest in policing and the law. You know, was law, for example, ever an option that you considered, or anything like that? Or was it always telling those stories?
No, it was the only thing. I was good in school. I was good at languages and I was good at English. I wasn't very good at science or anything like that. And, you know, because we went the Northern system, we didn't do leaving cert, we did A levels. So you do 3 subjects, and I was very lucky in that I did Italian, French and English, and I was very good at Italian and French. I went on to study Italian and French at university, and I got my English. So I always knew that I was going to be, I always knew, I'd say from, 12, 13, 14, I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. But that the attempted murder, it did have a massive effect on my life and my whole family's life. But it's, as I said, I have no doubt that's why I'm a journalist today. But I just became really, really interested in news, because I was living in a place where people were getting shot every day of the week. So you read the news, you watch the news, you listen to the news every hour just to see if there's anybody in your area, or if there been any bombs and where you live or whatever. You know what I mean? So it starts to close in on you, and it takes over your life. So the natural outlet for me was, and I read a lot when I was a kid, and I just think, watching that All the President's Men, hearing that about my dad, watching the news, and I just decided I want to be a journalist. And it was just a sort of marriage made in heaven for me. It just all came together, and I'm very lucky to have had. But I often wonder, like, we would have been financially bereft if my father had been murdered. I mean, totally. All my family, they were first in our generation. Our family, my generation, were the first to go to university. I would say, a single mother, 7 kids, living in, being very, very extremely working class, we would have been goosed. None of us would go to university. So, yeah, it's hard to underestimate those 10 seconds, I think they affected our lives.
It's just on the back of what you said, it's funny you mentioned the film All the President's Men and the novel. Many years after you'd seen it, I watched the movie, but it had a profound effect on me as well. And it really encapsulates like what it is to be a journalist. I think there's a scene in it where I'm going to get this wrong, but Woodward or Bernstein gets somebody on the record and they're almost in shock that he's just after saying, oh my God, like, and it's that feeling of, I've got the scoop. I've just broken that big story. Like it really captures that feeling, and like that like that's what the buzz that you get from getting a scoop, like that's what journalism's all about for me, and probably for you too, Mick.
Oh, absolutely. And I do want to talk about that more, but Paul, just to answer your question, Ciaran, for me, crime reporting or law enforcement is journalism at its purest, because we do stuff every day where people are not supposed to tell us things. Well, I'm talking about, people in law enforcement. I'm talking about criminals. I'm talking about, paramilitaries. None of these people are supposed to talk to us. Paul and I have to persuade people every day to talk to us. And I think it is the hardest challenge in journalism, because not to piss on any of my or other colleagues, but there are other beats where, it's quite okay to talk to journalists and you can be seen with your contacts. Paul and I know I could be standing, Paul and I could be in court together and Paul's best contact would come in and I wouldn't have a clue. And likewise, because we are just, that's our DNA, just to protect our sources. So there is a tremendous challenge in crime journalism. I find it's the hardest and it's the most rewarding.
We'll come back, I think, to your particular route, what papers you work for, etc., a little later. But just on that point, I'm keen to get across to people, potentially people who have an interest in journalism at a younger age or are looking to get into it, maybe even mid-career. What softer skills, I guess, do you think are important to make a successful journalist? Like, say, for example, you're talking about communication, you're talking about the ability to build networks in a kind of more abstract way. I don't know if anything particularly jumps to mind that is useful.
I'd like Paul to close his ears for a minute. He's got the best phone manner I've ever heard of any journalist. And that's a really, really important skill, because journalists, this was said to me when I started off, reporters like us, we're effectively salespeople. We have to try and convince someone to talk to us. And remember, we're contacting people in the hardest of times when they've lost people and they've suffered trauma. So I would definitely consider, and somebody said to me years ago, reporters like us should go on sales courses, because we have to learn how to talk to people properly. So Paul's very lucky. He's got that great phone sense. You definitely have to know, you have to be very empathetic, and I think you have to have very strong emotional intelligence. I'm not going to say who it is, but I remember, it was 28 years ago, there was someone was murdered and I was covering the funeral. It was up north and I was covering the funeral, and a very well-known journalist, it was very quiet in the graveyard. We were at the graveyard. The family let the media at the graveyard. It was a high-profile killing. And I remember a very high-profile journalist walking along, talking extremely loudly into his mobile phone, 15 feet from the family. And I won't say who he is, not to embarrass him, but I just thought that was it. And I was 27, 28, so I was just a kid, I thought, Jesus Christ, mate, what are you at? So you have to have empathy, you have to have emotional intelligence, and you have to have cop on, and I think you have to be very good with people. You don't have to be a good talker, because sometimes silence is the best tactic you can have. There's another journalist I know who, he has a great tactic. He just goes quiet when he's talking to you, and you fill the vacuum. Now, the second time he did it with me, I just stayed quiet, and the silence between us was on the phone. It lasted about 3 minutes, and it was excruciating, but he gave in. So, he was a bit of a one-trick pony, but it's a good strategy to have. So there are many of skills that I think journalists need, and Paul's going to tell me what other ones we should have.
I don't know if this is a skill, but I think you have to have an innate hunger in you. I think if you're hungry, that's half the battle. Like, if you really want it, I can only speak from my own personal experience, but I came into national news. I was very lucky. I came into the world of national newspapers with relatively no experience, and I could have very easily have been booted out the door, but I kept my foot in the door and I was determined. And to a certain degree, I kind of said, I'm not going anywhere. And I pushed and I pushed and I pushed, and I had that hunger and desire to learn, and thankfully the right people picked up on that, like Michael here, and lifted me up and I gained those skills over time. So I think if you have that hunger and that drive, like, that's half the battle. Because
yes, but Paul, you had sorry to interrupt you. You had everything you needed. You had the whole toolkit.
Well, thank you, but I think you have to want it. Like, if you're getting up in the morning and you don't want to get a story, if I'm going to go and doorstep that person, I'm going to get that scoop, I'm going to get that line. You have to really, really want it to be a good journalist, I think.
Yeah, and I'd also say if you're a crime reporter or a specialist, environmentalism, whatever, politics, I think you have to be more than slightly obsessive about your field. You have to know everything about it, because you'll never know when that one small nugget that you have in your brain will get you a story. I'll give you a perfect example. Years and years ago, I was talking to a lad, a guard, and he told me about a raid on a place where guards found crack cocaine. And I was going, oh yeah, that's very interesting. Nice wee Sunday story. They found crack cocaine. And he went, yeah, it was a factory, right? I went, oh yeah, that's no problem. And I was driving, and it was like one of those things you see in the movie. Literally a minute later, I sort of pressed on the brakes and rang him back and said, did you say a crack factory? Yeah, it's the first one in Ireland. So, and we got a great splash out of it. But so, in other words, you have to have your antennae the whole time. And when he said crack factory, I knew that it was the first in Ireland because I'd been covering it so long. So you really have to know your shit. Pardon my language, but you have to really, really drill down. So I cover guards, but I also cover the defence forces. Most crime reporters do defence as well. So I have to know about defence, and I have to have very high knowledge of crime and defence. And I think you need to have that level of knowledge if you want to be a specialist.
And just on that specialism point, you two are, without blowing your own trumpets. By the way, I made a note of that after 10 minutes mixed compliment to Paul, so I'm gonna cut that as a clip. Just what's rare is beautiful.
I was hacked.
But obviously, crime. Look, it's one of the most important beats out there. It's one of the most potentially fraught. It's one of the ones that involves confidence. It involves meticulousness. What drew you to crime initially? Was it just happenstance that someone was like, hey, this guy's leaving, you'd be a good fit for this? Or was it always a drive that you were wanting to move into that area? Paul, I might come to you first.
Well, I fell into it. I thought that I wanted to be a political correspondent. I thought that I was interested in politics. But I soon realised I wasn't. No, like when I got the job in the Star, and basically through mixed influence and through having to work in the world of crime, I have forced myself into it. But I think inevitably this happens, that it's just such an interesting subject, and it's fascinating just how the justice system works, how the guards work, the world of gangland, all of it, and I just, as Mick says, you have to kind of learn your subject, and I kind of just became engrossed in it, and now I can't imagine doing anything else. I think, and it's the most interesting and the most rewarding of all the fields that you could work in, really, I think. What was the second part of that question? I've gone off on a tangent. No,
it was just a general what brought you into it, and I guess the corollary of it is what you get from it, which I think you've given a reasonably good insight into.
Yeah,
already.
I think it's just the most exciting and the most dynamic, and like you were asking about skills earlier. I think another skill, although Mick doesn't have this skill, is patience.
Fucking hell.
The score settling pod.
If you have patience in this game, which I often don't have, but if you can just train yourself, like if you're doing stakeouts in particular, or if you're really determined to get something, if you just have the patience to sit with it, and you have the confidence that it's going to work out, it will work out, if that makes any sense at all. But like it's just so rewarding when you get that scoop or that line. And you never know, every day is different. Like in the world of politics, it's just so samey. I don't, no offense to any political correspondents, but it's just not half as it.
Oh, let's offend them. Let's offend them.
The truth is, it's just not half as interesting.
No, and it would be fair. Patience. I don't have patience, but I do have patience, and I think Paul's right. There are murder cases I've been at. I've stayed outside 12 hours. Everybody else is gone, and I said, I'm not going until I get what I need. And you just stay, and you invariably get it.
But what's interesting is, because I did politics at uni as well, and you get politics in crime. Crime is inherently political. How you police, how you dole out justice, this is all political stuff, but it's without all the boring stuff, without being too facetious about things. Mick, sorry, I realised we skirted slightly over a bit of background, how you came into things. So obviously you were based up in the north initially, is that right?
So I always knew, effectively, the only other thing I really considered doing was being an interpreter. And I very nearly did that after college, but I stuck with being a journalist, and I did the journalism course. So I did Italian French University on the recommendation of Dominic Cunningham, who was then in the Northern Bureau of the Irish Independent. He said, if you want to be a journalist, study languages. And luckily, it's what I was good at, so I did that. Did a postgrad in Strathclyde in Glasgow in 1993-94. Went back to Belfast, started freelancing for the Irish News, and I worked there, and I went away and worked for a local paper for a year and a half, came back, got staffed up. And then through hills and hunts, I ended up in Dublin, where I became Dublin correspondent for the Irish News in 1997. And that was a pivotal time because it was about the peace process. And, when you're a correspondent for the Irish News, they let you do politics, but you also did security. And you spoke to a lot of Republicans. So I sort of fell into what we called security, which was sort of political violence, if you want to, it was all about, there was decommission and all that sort of stuff. So I started making contacts, and I had built up a good reputation, and I built up a good knowledge base in that, discrete area of political violence. And so that started the ball rolling. And then I went to the Star, and from day one, I was doing crime from day one, and that was 23 years ago this month.
Excellent. Yeah, wow, isn't it? That's great. And we've touched on it, I suppose, briefly already. But if there were another subject that you would be drawn to in journalism, I guess, Paul, you were saying this is kind of your beat now and forever. But is there anything else that you might think, we might specialize in something else, or maybe even go a touch broader?
The honest answer is no. But to expand upon what you asked me about, like, what you get out of it, like, apart from just, as I said, it's a bit about it being exciting. It's only when I started to kind of make contact with families who, lost loved ones to murder, or victims of sexual abuse, and when you have given them a platform in which to tell their story, there's a reward in that, and a feeling of satisfaction that, you've highlighted something important. I know that's a bit cliche and cheesy, but I've had the fortune of interviewing a couple of people over the years now where I feel, that was an important story, and I'm glad that we highlighted it. And for me, that's the most rewarding part of the job. There are times when this job can really get to you, and you can sort of say, I want to pack it in and I want to do something else. But you have to remind yourself of the days when you feel like you wrote something important. There are many, many non-important things that we end up writing about at times. I'll admit that. Not every story is going to be memorable or Pulitzer Prize worthy or whatever you want to call it. But there are days when you feel like that was an important piece of journalism, and that's what kind of keeps you going. And you just have to remind yourself of that when you get the bad days. But no, I can't even begin to imagine what else I'd be doing.
Well, Paul was telling me off air he's got a big interest in environmentalism because he recycles all his stories.
Very good. Well, listen, I think we're 1-1 in the score settling stakes here, so we're all good today. Just to come on to another aspect of the job, because my background initially was kind of in sport and more news stuff, and then when I moved over here, obviously there's a far more focus on crime, and I was bumping up against aspects of Dublin, of Ireland, that I wouldn't have covered so much before. In terms of the danger element of the job, if we can call that, is that something that's on your mind? How much has that affected your life and career? I might come to you first with this, Mick.
Yes, it's everywhere. When I'm writing a story, I consider the forefront of my thought process is, am I going to get sued? But I'm also thinking about my own personal safety. It's a very dangerous job. I've spoken about this. I've received the Garda news of a death threat. So it's called the GIM, the Garda information message. And I was given that 2017. The guards had information there was a serious threat to your life. And it's a very lonely existence for a while. I don't think that the threat is live anymore. But for 6 months, it was really, really, really grim. So that was bad. And it did affect me. And, the older you get, like I've done this for 30 years, and it does weigh you down, and you do get into an awful lot of instances. I'm not even talking about, say, threats from gangsters. I'm talking about, people do feel as if you can have carte blanche against journalists, against reporters, that you can do what you want, you can say what you want. If you ever stand outside the CCJ in Dublin, where the main courts complex, the photographers get an awful time. It says people spit on them and everything and give them grief. So people do think that, in a way, doing things just doesn't really count. And there's definitely been a diminution of respect for media, and that's fine, that's no problem. But people are much more aggressive. So my own safety is something I do consider, along with legal threats. It's one of my top 2 issues that on every story, basically. And going to do doorsteps, driving into certain areas. I've said this before. I will always move the car so they're facing out of the street, so it can make a quick getaway rather than facing in. Various things like that. So I think every journalist, every reporter has to look after their own safety, because nobody else will.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been in a few hairy situations. I've not had anything, thankfully, on that level, the level that you have, Mick. We've talked about this before, but the stress of having a threat on your life, I can't imagine that. But just every day when you do this job, you become conscious of the things that you write and the places that you go. Could this potentially lead to putting myself in danger? I'm going to speak in more general terms, but I had something happen to me that was not pleasant. I'll just put it that way. I don't really want to give it too much credence, because it thankfully sorted itself out, but it was something as a result of doing this job. I was put in a position where I was being harassed to a degree. And look, everybody has the right to free speech and to have their say, but when it goes that little extra step further and someone is attacking you personally, it does make you reassess things. And as Mick says, it's a very lonely experience. You can explain it to your superiors and people you work with, and they might understand it to a degree, but no one really understands it unless they're going through it themselves. And it's, so, I try to remind myself when things like that happen, this is a job, and it should only be a job. If it starts affecting your personal life in that respect, it does make you consider at times, should it be bleeding into your personal life? But you kind of have to accept when you're writing about very sensitive subjects and very dangerous people at times, that you're putting yourself in a potential position to be threatened or to be harassed or whatever. So we have to have a thick skin. I'm not saying it didn't bother me. It bothered me, but I was addressed and have to move on, and I'm sure it'll happen again. That's the inevitability of what happens when you work in crime journalism, I suppose. And
just to expand on this a bit, I'm further down the road than Paul. I always say this, a guy I used to work with, Pat O'Connell, in the Sunday Tribune, or the Sunday World now. I'm 10 years ahead of him. He's 10 years ahead of Paul. Pat had Paul's job before him. So I'm further down the road. And I'm going to say this with a shadow of a doubt. My job has affected me. I'm not going to say my mental health, but it has made me a darker person. It's made me a sadder person. Because when you think about it, I've covered 1,000 deaths, 700, 800 homicides, plane crashes, horrible things and we hear things that, people in the real world, shall we say, don't have. They can turn over the page. We have to be in court for the rape victim, or we have to be in court hearing about child abuse, or, when child abuse material sometimes is played in court, all that sort of stuff. So all those things have made me a darker person. They have made my life darker, and I completely admit that. But I'm 52 now, so I won't be doing anything else anytime soon. And I get a huge amount out of it. It's fantastic talking to people and one-on-one relationships, even knocking on doors. I really, really enjoy that. But there are serious negatives for this job, and it has definitely made my life darker. And I often wonder, as I said, I did consider being an interpreter in Italian. And I've often, in really bad days when it's hitting the fan, I was going, what the hell am I doing? I could be living in Milan, interpreting and doing 500 quid a day and living in the sun and having lovely limoncello and stuff. What am I doing standing outside this geezer's house? But the job, it's the job and I love it. But, you know, there are moments when you go, I could have completely had a different life.
But it is interesting because, you know, and I think the gravity of what you both are saying is clear for all to hear, but it's such an important job, and to tell people's stories and to be the mediator, as you know, media suggests, between the audience and between stories that need to be heard. So on behalf of our audience and on behalf of myself, I'd like to say thank you very much for the work that you do. And I'm sure, as we've all experienced, thankfully, through journalism at some stage, someone really giving you a heartfelt thank you from you know, a victim's family or whoever it might be is really, really touching. It is really it does make all of the other stuff worthwhile. Do you think
that's one of the best things? That is honestly one of the best things when you tell a victim story. And a perfect example is when we write about sex offenders and the victim comes to us and says, listen, he can't be named. Can you try and get him named? And we do. I mean, there are various things we can do, or we give them advice, because they want, as I always say, the abuse happens in private and they want the justice to be in public. And it's a tremendously important thing that we do. And the number of victims who said, you really helped me with that. So it means a lot.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me because I've said this to friends before. This job's like a drug. Like when it's amazing, it's really, it can't be bettered in my eyes. Like I've done the whole communication stuff before, and don't get me wrong, you know, I worked on interesting stuff, but it never ever touched the thrill that this job can give you when things go well and when you are telling really interesting stories.
Plus the other big thing, which people don't really know, we know secrets, we know things before practically everybody else in the country knows. And it's brilliant knowing things.
Yeah, it's not all serious and dreary though. I mean, you do have great fun in the job. There's no job quite like it in terms of the crack that you can have as well. Like I think one good story that we kind of touched on the last day, I think we should talk about a bit more detail, because both Mick and I experienced it, and we very rare that we would ever go away together on a job in this country, let alone in another one. Well, but I just think this is good crack because it really shows like how the job can be, like, you know, so random. Like, so like this time last year, the story broke about the sanctions against the Kinahan cartel, and somehow we managed to swing a gig away to Spain, the two of us, with photographer Mick O'Neill. Now I think the original plan was to divide and conquer. We were going, but you know, look, I mean, there were reasons why we went together, and we were basically going to hit all of the properties that the American government, the US authorities had said were associated with the Kinahans in Spain, and we were going to do like several pieces of, this is Daniel Kinahan's old haunt, this is Christie's old haunt, this is there were a couple of other properties and businesses associated with them. So Mick, I don't know when you want to stop me here, but Mick got very excited, shall we say, about the prospect of going away, and he said we need to get flights booked, and we may or may not have booked flights to the wrong airport.
Well, no, it wasn't the wrong airport. It was no, there's never a wrong airport. It was basically I wanted us to get there very quickly, right? So I decided, right, listen, it was obviously
the first flight out.
It was the first flight out. Now it was, we wanted to go to Marbella because that's, you know, the Costa del Sol, or Andalusia as Healy probably calls it. We wanted to go down there, right? Now the only flight we could get was Alicante, which is in the Costa Brava. Is Costa Brava or Costa Dorada? I think Costa Brava. And it was 8 hours north. And I said, I don't give two shiny whatevers. We're getting on that plane, we're hiring a car, and we're driving down to Marbella. And we did. Now, Paul wasn't overly impressed. So that
what ensued was a 8 or 9 hour road trip across mainland Spain.
And we've got the exclusive footage here today. Yeah, well, that must have been really interesting, though, the whole trip. What did you get out of it?
Oh, like, it was good. Obviously, it was good crack and good banter going, the three of us in the car, but we were also under serious fucking pressure because we realised, like, we actually have to get a story. We have to come home with a story. And, you know, the Kinahans were not in Spain anymore. So what exactly were we over there to get? We had to get something. And I think maybe it was the 8 or 9 hour drive. But by the time we got to Marbella and we tracked down and found one of the properties that had been named in the US sanctions, maybe we weren't fully thinking straight. That's all I can say in my defense to this. But we discovered this property which was associated with Christy Kinahan, and we were basically preparing a video package where Mick, I can recall, said something to the effect of, "This is the alleged headquarters of Christy Kinahan Sr." Now,
we didn't.
In his defense,
we didn't say alleged.
Well, you didn't. You actually just flat out said that it was. In his defense, the American government announced this exact address as, so it would be like, Ciaran, or, you know, if tomorrow your full address was published to the world to see, and it was, you know, it's this is Christy Kinahan's address. So we did that, and we went back then the next morning to scope it out again and to do more photographs of it. And as we did a drive-by of the property, this man walks out. Now, we thought it was empty, abandoned, you know, naturally, because obviously Kinahan hadn't been there in years. This bloke walks out. We all get the shock of our lives. Holy shit, there's somebody in the fucking place. So we drive off really fucking quickly. And Mick O'Neill is trying to get a photograph of this individual, and we get kind of a grainy shot of this man in a suit. And again, I blame this on lack of sleep and the long drive. We all kind of said, could that be a Kinahan? So we then ended up essentially staking out this property for several hours while waiting for this individual to get a proper photograph of him. And hours and hours and hours passed in the baking hot heat, 30 degrees, sitting in a car with no air conditioning. And Mick eventually had enough and decided that he would go off on a little walkabout. And we didn't hear from him for a little while. But he came, as we alluded to in the previous pod, he did come back with McDonald's, so all was forgiven. But we got photographs of this individual, and we couldn't work out for the life of us who the fuck he was. Who is this man? Who is this person?
Now, in fairness, we were thinking he could be a relation of a Kinahan, because there was a resemblance.
But then, like, we couldn't figure out who he was. So push came to shove, and you said, right, fuck it, we're just going to have to knock on the bloody door. And this is where Michael's skills come into the fore, because to his credit, we went up and we knocked on the door, and Mick spoke to this man in Spanish, and he was actually a Spanish resident, and I think that got us the in, because he appreciated the fact that we were speaking to him in his native tongue. But as the twist turned out, he was not a Kinahan. He was a perfectly normal member of society. But more than that, he was a local councillor, so like a well-known political figure in the area, and he was a lawyer. So thank God we knocked on that door, because we could have ended up alleging that this poor man's home was once the headquarters of the Kinahan cartel. But as it turned out, like, we're not the ones that alleged that. It was the American government that had placed his address for the world to see. But we ended up getting the story we never anticipated that we would ever get. It was a cracker of a story. This guy posed for photographs in his mansion with his pool, and was totally dumbfounded that the American government had named his property as being associated with the Kinahan cartel. So we got a great cracker of a yarn out of it, and a funny story. And
that always proves the point, and that's one thing we say in the start. You always go, because you always get something when you go. Now, the funny thing is, we had done a video the day before we confronted this geezer, and it was all about this mansion behind us. It just looks like any other house here in the Costa del Sol, but we know there's a dark secret behind it, because that's where the Kinahan cartel was based for several years. And it was that fella, and he was inside on his Instagram worrying about what he was going to have for his dinner, wasn't he?
Yeah, so we'd worked out, because we looked up his Instagram later, we'd worked out that around about the time that we were filming this video saying that this has a dark secret and it was the headquarters of the Kinahans, he had posted a photograph of like a salad or something, or no, it was a cheese board. That's what it was. he was fixing a cheese board in his kitchen, like, you know, unbeknownst to him, like what's going on outside. But he got a laugh out of it.
But we were at the same time, we were also sitting outside going, Jesus, lads, what are we going to do? Are we going to knock? And we're going, God, it's a bit dangerous. If it just says again, and what's going to happen? He's in working and worrying about his cheese board. We were sitting outside going, will we do this? Will we do this, lads? Anyway, but that is Paul's absolutely, that is the beauty of journalism.
It wasn't the story we like to get, but it was it was a very amusing and great story, like.
Yeah, and it just goes to show you it's, you know, 99% slow and then 1% fast, speed and terror, and, you know, but we usually get there in the end.
I think the most terrifying thing about the whole thing is the idea of brie in 30 degrees and bad weather. One thing I was quite interested to know, and you guys have covered it a little bit there, the stories that stand out, and obviously that one's a very specific type of story. Are there ones that really stick in your mind in terms of, you know, you just think, not only was that a really important story, we did a fantastic job with it. I mean, individually, it doesn't just have to be with the Star or wherever it might be. Are there any particular cases you may have covered, any particular trials, any particular stories you may have told?
I'll talk about this one. It was, Paul knows, I got an award in 2017, Crime Reporter of the Year, and one of the stories we got it for it was, well, there was a couple. One we got pictures of Christy Kinnan in Hong Kong, and then another one we did was, if you remember the London Bridge terror attack, that happened on the Saturday night, and on the Sunday morning I was at home going, Jesus, isn't that terrible? And someone contacted me and said, listen, there's an Irish link to one of those fellas because they were shot dead. Do you remember the attackers were shot dead? One of those attackers had all they could say was had Irish ID on them, and I went, Jesus. So I got, you know, it was about 9:30 in the morning, and I didn't get it confirmed until about 8 o'clock that night. And he did. He lived in Ireland, and, you know, the whole story emerged. So we broke that, and it was Sunday for Monday. So it appeared in the Monday, and it was a bank holiday. I always remember it was a bank holiday, and it was a pretty massive story because we were the only ones to get the Irish link, and, you know, it dominated everywhere. Anyway, RTE lifted it, as is their wont, and I went, all right, okay, they've lifted it. That's grand. It happens. And then Reuters lifted it from RTE and credited RTE. So I was in the newsroom watching Reuters. It was on Sky. Reuters were crediting RTE for my story. So I was going, absolutely do laddie. But that happens. But I really enjoyed was that maybe 8-hour period when you have a sniff of something and you're doing everything you can to get it confirmed because they knew it was going to be a worldwide story. And it did go around the world. But just that sort of 8 hours when you know you have something and you're digging away, and then you get the confirmation from it. There's no feeling like it.
Yeah, you have a greater memory than me. So many of them are coming to mind, but no one specifically sticks out. But I would, this is a bit of a kind of a, maybe it might seem like a cop-out answer. Like there are exclusive stories that I have gotten that I've been proud of. But I think the most profound, and maybe it's because it's the most recent and the longest thing that I've covered, is actually the Hutch trial. And I think for me, it's just like Michael has sat through a couple of trials in their entirety. That is the first time in my career that I have sat, okay, not every day, but almost every single day of a massive, massive trial that was the biggest story. And for me, like I just kind of it probably will always stick in my memory covering that trial and doing this podcast, and I'm just proud of it, and like I've enjoyed sitting in it, the experience of it.
Yeah, and just on the Hutch trial, because, you know, a lot of people will have tuned into this pod specifically for that initially, at least. What did you get from that? Like, did you sort of, you know, now you've had a bit of distance between it, was there anything in particular you took from it, kind of in I guess a professional sense? Was there things where you thought, you know, we did that really well, we did that less well, etc.?
I think this podcast allowed me to open the door into another form of journalism that I've never worked in before, and to be able to actually discuss what I've seen in detail in the trial every day. I don't want to criticize print journalism. It obviously has its merits, but it has its limitations in terms of there's only so much of the trial that you can report, and things are cut. But we got to sit here every day and really inform people of every minute of every second, but also because it was a special criminal court trial, you had a bit of freedom to talk about things like just what it feels like, the atmosphere in the room, people's body language, stuff like that. So I've never done that kind of reporting before. I've never, it was just a new medium for me. So that for me professionally was a real thrill to be able to kind of inform in a new platform. And I think we did build a bit of an audience. So we had people contacting us who were saying that they were actually getting their information from this podcast. They weren't necessarily maybe reading about it, although we want people to continue to read newspapers, but people were coming here first. And so that was a real thrill that we were able to inform people in that way.
And it has been, it's become a new form for me as well, a new form of journalism. It has helped me, really, one of the things I like about this pod is that we contextualize things and explain, and we tell our stories, and I think we educate and entertain at the same time. And so the pod coming from the Hutch trial really has exploded for me, and it has rejuvenated journalism for me, I have to say, because it's another form of journalism.
Yeah, it's nice to see. It's really nice to see. And that comes nicely into one of my last two questions here is, obviously we're seeing a changing media background. Things are constantly shifting. Thankfully, people are interested in stuff like this and longer form discussions and journalism. How have you seen it change over the period that you were here? And I suppose really my question is, are we on the right path, or are there things that, potentially worry you about the state of journalism or the state of media in general at the moment in Ireland?
What a minefield of a question. You're going to get us fired for that one.
Absolute minefield. So why don't you tap dance across it and we'll see how we get on.
I'll answer that. Journalism has to move and it has to evolve. When I started in journalism, long time ago, there were largely morning papers, there were evening papers, there was radio, and there was TV and Sunday papers, and that was it. Now you look, and even, I had a discussion with somebody a while ago about the word journalist. Oh yeah, it was about Gary Lineker. I consider Gary Lineker a journalist. Some people don't, but I do, and I consider him a broadcaster and a presenter and, all that sort of thing. Journalism has to evolve. See, even people who call themselves citizen journalists, knock yourselves out. Anybody can call themselves a journalist, but very few people can do what Paul and I do. I always call myself, we're reporters, because a journalist can mean anything from somebody who runs a pod to somebody who corrects my horrible spelling mistakes in the Star and the Mirror, or, it can be anything. We're reporters, and I think there'll always be a need for people like us to go and do the hard slogging and the hard lifting and tell people what's going on. So journalism is completely changing, and I'm quite cool with that, whatever it is, but there'll always be a need for people like me and Paul.
God, I hope he's right. I really hope he's right about that.
Yeah, actually, you might stay on the call. I've got a bit of bad news for you both.
I think I'll give you a short answer. Just, I'm obviously hopeful for the future. I think through new mediums like this, journalism will survive. People are interested in being informed. The fact that people were willing to sit and listen to us for an hour on end talking about the Hutch trial shows that people have an interest in being informed. So clearly, journalism is not dead. People are still interested. It's just perhaps the medium will change and evolve over time. And hopefully in 20 years' time, we'll still be working in it.
Well, you will, not me.
Not for you.
And anyone who has been interested in the Hutch trial, listening to it, you're more than welcome to edit the pod as well. It would save me a lot of work. But listen, lads, you've been fantastic. I wonder, I might just leave you with one question. Now, as I say, we were all at one stage or another interested in journalism. We were, potentially looking at going into it as a career, or are there any particular things that you would like to pass off to the next generation as your particular pearls of wisdom, or really? All right, let me start. For example, I came to it via a quite circuitous route. I did a few different jobs, kind of circling journalism for quite a long time. It came about through just emails to people who I listened to, who I was interested in, who thankfully gave me a shot. And once I was in there, I was very hungry, as you said, in that sense of just learning and trying to improve. And I didn't have a journalistic background per se, in the sense of studying journalism and the like. So I just wonder if there's anything that you would recommend to people who might have an interest in pursuing a job.
I think I probably maybe already said it, in that just be hungry. If you really, really want it, you'll get it. But you have to keep at it. You have to work at it. it's very, very cliche, but it's half the battle, as I said. If you're really, really hungry, and you also have to meet the right people. I mean, I was lucky enough to meet the right people. Doors opened to me once I started to meet the right people. But as I said, it was the enthusiasm I think I showed that meant the right people put trust in me and put faith in me. So if you really want it, keep at it. That's cliche, but it's true.
I think if you work your yin-yangs off, you're more or less guaranteed to succeed. And if you don't work your yin-yangs off, you're not going to succeed. I mean, people might not want to hear that, because people might want to hear about, well, it's all about nepotism and, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't have anybody in my family. I'm a working class kid from North Belfast. Absolutely nobody in my family worked in any form of media. I think it's the same for you, Paul.
Yeah, no one ever. Yeah.
Right. So, I think we're doing quite okay by ourselves. I will say one final point, just what you're saying about, maybe grief and stuff. I do think that an awful lot of people who attack journalists are frustrated journalists. In other words, they wanted to be journalists and they never made it, or it never happened for them, and they sort of vicariously attack us online for that. But look, just as I said, if you want it, work hard for it and you'll get it.
Fair play. And go direct. People always respect people getting emails or get in touch via email, etc., etc. Listen, lads, thank you so much for your time. I realise we have another pod to do, but I really appreciate you guys giving us a little look back, and I'm sure people have got a lot out of it. So thanks again, and we'll speak soon.